"You're lying." The words ripped through the congressional chamber like a gunshot. Pam Bondi's voice, sharp and searing, cracked against the walls as if she could bend the truth by sheer volume. For a moment, the room froze. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, aides stiffened, and cameras tilted, hungry to capture every flicker of drama. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a battlefield, and Bondi had chosen her weapon, rage. But the power of a shout is fleeting. The louder it is, the faster it dies, leaving silence heavy in its wake. And in that silence every eye turned, not to Bondi, but to Jasmine Crockett. She sat there unshaken, her posture calm, her gaze steady. If Bondi was the storm, it was the steel tower standing firm against it. The air thickened with tension. This was the clip that would travel across timelines, the headline that would set comment sections ablaze. Bondi's outburst wasn't just an accusation. It was an attempt to brand, to smear, to discredit in front of a nation already divided. For Bondi, yelling "You're lying" was a performance, an exclamation mark meant to drown out nuance, to dominate the narrative by sheer force. But here's the truth about volume: it can't substitute for substance. And as the echo of her voice dissolved into murmurs, you could feel the imbalance shifting. The cameras didn't linger on Bondi's fury. They lingered on Crockett's calm. The crowd sensed it, the pause stretched, the weight of anticipation pressing on every heartbeat in that chamber. Social media watchers clipped the outburst in real time, their fingers already firing captions. Bondi loses it on Crockett. But what none of them could capture yet was the electricity building in that silence, the storm about to break in the opposite direction. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She wasn't even fazed. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in calculation, the type of look a chess player gives when their opponent has just made the wrong move. The cameras closed in. Members of Congress shifted forward, waiting, knowing instinctively that something was coming. Pam Bondi thought she had won the moment with a scream, but the reply that followed, no one in Congress was ready for it. The outburst was shocking, yes, but to understand its true weight, you have to step back and see the stage it happened on. This wasn't some closed-door exchange or a forgettable committee squabble. This was a high-profile hearing broadcast live, dissected in real time by millions of eyes online. The kind of hearing where every word spoken didn't just echo inside the chamber, it ricocheted through news feeds, headlines, and dinner-table conversations across America. The nation was tense. The political climate wasn't simply polarized. It was electrified. On one side, a chorus of voices demanding accountability, dignity, and truth. On the other, a wall of defiance fueled by bluster, finger pointing, and the hope that noise could mask weakness. Into that collision stepped Jasmine Crockett, a freshman representative but already a rising voice for the unheard. Sitting across from her was Pam Bondi, a former state attorney general turned cable fixture, confident that her notoriety and sharp tongue could cut through any defense. The chamber itself felt less like a hearing room and more like an arena. Cameras lined the back walls, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Every aide knew that one clip, one exchange, could spin into a viral storm before the gavel even dropped. The press gallery was braced, pens ready to scribble the next headline, and at the center sat two women, each representing something larger than themselves. For Bondi, this was about dominance, an attempt to prove that volume and accusation could still reign supreme in American politics. She leaned on a playbook written years ago: shout, attack, discredit, and dare the other side to keep up. For Crockett, this wasn't just about defending herself. It was about defending a community that knew what it meant to be accused unfairly, dismissed too quickly, silenced too easily. That's why the stakes were higher than they seemed. Bondi's yell wasn't just about Crockett. It was about sending a message: we can still shout you down. But Crockett's silence in response, the calm before her words, was its own kind of defiance, one that carried the weight of every immigrant parent, every working-class family, every young black woman who had ever been told to sit down and take it. And the viewers at home felt it. Clips of the hearing spread instantly, but so did the commentary. Tweets poured in. Bondi just lost it. Crockett looks unshaken. TikTok edits layered dramatic music over the moment, pausing at Crockett's steady expression. The public wasn't just watching. They were choosing sides, shaping the narrative in real time. Inside the chamber, you could feel the shift. Members leaned forward, sensing that something bigger than a policy dispute was happening. This was no longer about questions and answers. It was about who controlled the narrative of truth. Bondi thought her scream had stamped that narrative with authority, but authority built on arrogance is fragile. It cracks under the pressure of composure, and as Crockett prepared to speak, the silence in the chamber grew heavy, charged with possibility, because this wasn't just politics. It was identity. It was truth versus spectacle. Dignity versus derision. Bondi thought she could dominate the room, but she underestimated who was sitting across from her. To understand why Pam Bondi's outburst landed with such force, and why it mattered so much, you have to understand Pam Bondi herself. For years, she has cultivated a reputation not as a quiet negotiator or a bridge builder, but as a fighter. A former prosecutor turned state attorney general, Bondi built her brand on being the sharp voice in the room, the one who would call people out, press charges, and lean into the spotlight with the confidence of someone who believed she was always on the winning side. She didn't just prosecute cases, she prosecuted narratives. Her press conferences became as notable as her court filings, her television appearances as valuable as her legal arguments. And when she stepped away from public office, she didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, she pivoted into the role of political commentator and defender of the conservative cause, sliding easily into cable news studios where heated arguments were currency and confrontation was applause. Bondi thrived on being underestimated. Early in her career, opponents often dismissed her as just another polished figurehead with a sharp tongue. But she proved again and again that she could weaponize that underestimation. She relished the role of attacker, of aggressor, of someone unafraid to point a finger and raise her voice. That, in her world, was strength. Yet strength built on intimidation often comes at a cost. Her critics noted a pattern, accusations flung with vigor but without nuance, a habit of bulldozing over opposition rather than engaging with them. There were controversies, her ties to powerful allies, her role in high-profile cases that raised eyebrows about fairness and integrity. Each time, Bondi doubled down, refusing to acknowledge fault, brushing off critics as partisan or irrelevant. To her supporters, it was fearlessness. To her detractors, it was arrogance dressed as confidence. And arrogance was central to the persona that entered that congressional chamber. Bondi believed her volume could drown out dissent. She believed her resume, long, polished, full of courtroom victories and television appearances, would shield her from challenge. She believed that the room, the cameras, and the nation would recognize her as the seasoned fighter she had always been. But arrogance has a blind spot. It mistakes intimidation for invincibility. It assumes the past can predict the future. And that's why in that chamber Bondi leaned on the move she knew best, an aggressive outburst, a loud accusation meant to seize control of the narrative before it could escape her grasp. "You're lying," wasn't just an exclamation. It was the embodiment of Bondi's entire career strategy. Loud, direct, accusatory, designed to put her opponent on defense before they had a chance to gather themselves. In her mind, Crockett would shrink back, stumble, maybe even lose her composure in the face of such a public and personal attack. That's how it usually worked. But there's a reason her critics often accused her of playing to the cameras rather than the truth. Because when the performance ends, what remains is not always substance, it's spectacle, and spectacle is a dangerous weapon when it collides with someone who refuses to play by the script. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Bondi had carried herself as though the outcome was predetermined. Her allies hyped her up as a seasoned warrior, someone too polished, too experienced to be rattled. She walked into that room with the swagger of a veteran, convinced that her voice would drown out any challenger. And in a way, she wasn't wrong. Her voice did dominate, for a moment. The room did freeze when she shouted. The cameras did swing her way, but power that relies on shock is fleeting. The more shocking the blow, the more devastating the silence that follows. Bondi projected confidence, but confidence without humility is brittle. And as she leaned into her familiar playbook of accusation and dominance, she failed to notice that the woman across from her was not flustered, not intimidated, not breaking under the weight of that yell. Instead, Jasmine Crockett sat with a calm that cut sharper than any raised voice. Because, for all her bluster, Bondi was about to face something she hadn't prepared for. To see why Jasmine Crockett's silence in that moment carried such weight, you have to understand the path that brought her there. Unlike her opponent across the table, Crockett didn't enter politics with fanfare, television studios, or an established network cheering her on. Her journey was built from the ground up, carved out of the grit of advocacy, persistence, and the unshakable belief that those without a voice deserved someone to speak for them. Born into a world that didn't hand her the keys to power, Crockett learned early what struggle looked like. She saw communities working twice as hard for half the recognition. Families scraping to make ends meet while politicians debated their humanity from comfortable podiums. And she didn't just observe, she absorbed it, carrying those lessons into adulthood, where they shaped her approach to both law and politics. Before she was a congresswoman, Crockett was an attorney who spent her days defending the rights of those society often overlooked. Protesters, working people, families caught in the crosshairs of injustice. She stood beside them not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. Courtrooms became her proving ground, places where she honed not just her knowledge of the law, but her ability to remain calm when the odds were stacked against her. While others raised their voices, Crockett sharpened her arguments. While others tried to intimidate, she focused on clarity, precision, and truth. That's the thing about people who grow up fighting for space. They learn composure not as a choice, but as survival. For Crockett, every dismissal, every underestimation became fuel. And by the time she arrived in Congress, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a force shaped by years of being underestimated, and using that underestimation to her advantage. Crockett's style in debate quickly set her apart. Where others leaned on theatrics, she leaned on poise. Her delivery was sharp, often laced with wit, but never without control. She had a knack for turning insults into stepping stones, for flipping an attack back on its origin with such elegance that it left critics scrambling. People began to notice that her calmness wasn't passive, it was strategic, and yet, despite her skill, she remained an underdog in the eyes of many. Bondi, with her years of notoriety, carried an aura of dominance. Crockett, newer to the national stage, was painted by some as untested, easy prey for a seasoned aggressor. That miscalculation would prove costly, because Crockett wasn't just representing herself in that chamber. She carried with her the weight of countless others who had been shouted down, interrupted, told they didn't belong. Every immigrant whose accent was mocked. Every woman of color told to calm down while being disrespected. Every working class American ignored until their patience broke. Crockett embodied them all, and in doing so, turned her silence into a form of resistance stronger than Bondi's scream. Her supporters already knew this about her. They had seen her take punches in debates without losing stride. They had seen her turn mockery into applause with a single clever retort. But for millions of Americans tuning into this hearing, this was their first introduction. And what they saw wasn't a politician flustered by an insult. It was someone who carried herself with the confidence of lived experience, the kind of confidence you can't fake with volume or arrogance. Crockett understood something Bondi did not. Dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself in the moments when others try to strip it away. And that's why, When the cameras caught her expression after Bondi's outburst, people leaned in. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was steadiness. There's a particular kind of strength in refusing to meet rage with rage. In a world where politics often rewards the loudest voice, Crockett chose a different weapon. Patience sharpened into precision. She had been here before, not in the grandeur of a congressional chamber, but in the smaller battles where lives still hung in the balance. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, and she knew how to make dismissal backfire. So when Bondi walked into that hearing with the swagger of certainty, Crockett recognized the move instantly. She'd seen it before from prosecutors, politicians, even everyday skeptics. And every time, she had found a way to turn the tables. This time would be no different. The chamber was watching, social media was watching, the country was watching, and Jasmine Crockett, the underdog so many had written off, sat at the center of it all, ready, steady, and unshaken. And when Bondi pointed her finger and shouted, Crockett didn't flinch. The chamber, already tense, began to buzz as the verbal sparring took shape. Pam Bondi, riding the momentum of her outburst, leaned forward with the confidence of someone used to controlling the tempo. Her voice cut in again, louder, sharper, overlapping Crockett's attempts to respond. Every interruption was designed not just to derail the conversation, but to remind the room, I am the aggressor here. But Jasmine Crockett didn't match the volume. She didn't need to. Instead, she paused, just long enough to let Bondi's interruptions hang awkwardly in the air. That silence made Bondi's bluster feel less like strength and more like desperation. It was a courtroom technique Crockett had carried with her. When your opponent tries to overwhelm, you let them talk themselves into exhaustion while you conserve your power for the strike. Bondi slammed forward again, raising her voice another octave. You can sit there and pretend all you want, but the facts, Congresswoman. Crockett began calm, her voice low but resonant. Bondi cut in again. Don't you dare try to spin this. The American people. The audience shifted in their seats. Staffers glanced at each other, eyes wide. Even some members of the committee seemed caught between curiosity and discomfort. The tension wasn't just audible, it was physical, vibrating through the room like static. Every camera zoomed in, desperate to catch the expressions that words alone couldn't capture. And Crockett's expression never wavered. She waited, letting Bondi burn through another wave of interruptions. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, onlookers sensing that Crockett wasn't being silenced, she was preparing. The restraint in her silence was louder than Bondi's shouting. It drew the audience's focus the way a still figure commands attention in a crowded room. Finally, Crockett leaned slightly forward, her voice just above a whisper, forcing the microphones to amplify her words. Are you finished? The room broke into hushed laughter, not roaring, not disruptive, just the quiet release of tension from those who recognized the shift. Bondi blinked, her rhythm fractured. She wasn't used to being met with surgical calm. Her strategy depended on ruffling feathers, knocking her opponent off balance. But Crockett wasn't budging. Instead, she began to answer measured, deliberate, as if each word had been chosen long before Bondi's first shout. She laid out her points methodically, every fact crisp, every phrase sharpened by composure. And with each sentence the imbalance grew. Bondi tried to interject again, but the interruptions no longer landed as thunderclaps. They sounded like static, background noise against Crockett's clarity. One by one, the murmurs in the chamber turned into a current of energy. Staffers leaned in, reporters scribbled notes furiously, and the cameras locked onto Crockett's face, sensing the story unfolding in real time. Bondi raised her voice again, desperate to seize control, but the louder she shouted, the smaller she seemed. Crockett didn't have to yell her, she only had to hold the line, and the longer the exchange continued, the clearer it became that the line was not moving. It was like watching a boxing match where one fighter swings wildly, burning energy with every punch, while the other stays composed, blocking, waiting, knowing the knockout isn't about speed, it's about timing. Bondi was swinging with all her might. Crockett was waiting, steady, surgical, The murmurs turned into a hum, the energy in the chamber tilted. People knew they were witnessing a turning point, though they couldn't yet see what was about to land. Crockett took a slow breath, adjusted her chair, and leaned into the microphone. The pause stretched, and the room collectively inhaled. Then Crockett leaned in, adjusted the mic, and delivered the line heard around the country. The room was silent when Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. That silence wasn't empty. It was charged, trembling with anticipation. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Lenses zoomed in, waiting for her to respond to Bondi's volcanic eruption. And then she spoke, not loudly, not with the theatrics of someone trying to win the moment with noise. Her voice was measured, steady, the kind of tone that forces people to lean forward, to listen more carefully. "Pam," she began, the simplicity of using her first name landing like a deliberate strike. "If you're going to accuse me of lying, then at least be prepared to explain what the lie is." The chamber shifted. A few audible gasps cut through the silence. Crockett didn't stop. She pressed forward, her cadence precise, each word carved cleanly. "You stood here, red-faced, shouting for the cameras, but shouting doesn't make facts disappear. It doesn't rewrite reality. It only shows us how desperate you are to silence voices you can't control." Bondi tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand. Calm, not commanding, but firm enough that even the chair of the committee didn't step in. The move itself was telling. Crockett wasn't afraid of Bondi's interruptions anymore. She was setting the tempo now. "Let's be very clear," Crockett continued, turning to address the entire chamber, her gaze sweeping across the lawmakers as if she were speaking directly to each one. "The record shows exactly what was said and what was not. You can replay the tape, read the transcript, examine the documents. Truth doesn't hide. Truth doesn't need to yell." The murmurs began again, louder this time. Phones lit up in the gallery, reporters typing furiously. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Crockett wasn't reacting to Bondi's accusation. She was exposing the tactic behind it, and then came the pause. She let the silence stretch, her calm expression drawing every eye toward her. Strategic, surgical, she knew the weight of a pause could crush arrogance faster than a scream. When she spoke again, her voice dropped slightly, each syllable deliberate. "The real question isn't whether I'm lying. The real question is why you're so afraid of the truth." The words hit like a hammer. You could feel it ripple across the chamber. Bondi's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out fast enough. For the first time, her confidence faltered. The mask slipped. Crockett seized the moment. "You've built a career on pointing fingers," she said, her tone still controlled but sharpened with precision, "on shouting people down instead of lifting them up, on mistaking volume for virtue. But this—" She gestured gently toward the crowd, the cameras, the committee. "This isn't a courtroom where you can browbeat a jury. This is the people's house, and here facts still matter." The energy in the chamber surged. Heads nodded. Side glances turned into full stares at Bondi, who now shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her earlier fire looked less like confidence and more like panic. Crockett pressed on, dismantling Bondi's accusation piece by piece. She cited the transcript of the previous session, the context of her remarks, the timeline of evidence. Each point was laid out with calm clarity. Each fact another brick in a wall Bondi could no longer climb over. And with every fact, Crockett's composure made Bondi's aggression look smaller. Bondi muttered under her breath, trying to interject again, but Crockett didn't flinch. She let the interruption hang, then resumed as though nothing had happened. It was a masterclass in control. She wasn't just winning the argument, she was showing the country how to win against arrogance itself. Then came the moment that sealed it. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, lowering her voice until it was almost conversational. "You know, I've been underestimated my entire life. People assumed they could talk over me, shout me down, tell me where I don't belong. And do you know what I learned? That the louder they get, the closer I am to the truth." The chamber erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective hum of recognition, a sound that was part gasp, part applause, part stunned silence. Crockett didn't break eye contact with Bondi as she spoke, and Bondi's expression revealed everything. The fire was gone. In its place was the unease of someone who realized the moment had slipped beyond her control, and Crockett wasn't finished. "Pam, when you yelled you're lying, you weren't talking to me. You were talking to yourself, because deep down you know the only way you can win is by shouting down the truth. But the truth doesn't go away just because you're uncomfortable with it. It stands, it endures, and today it's standing right here." The words landed like a gavel. The committee chair shifted uneasily, perhaps realizing the hearing had transformed into something much bigger than procedure. Reporters glanced at one another, silently acknowledging they'd just witnessed the soundbite that would dominate the news cycle. Bondi's hands clenched on the desk. She tried to fire back, but her voice cracked the once commanding tone now strained. Every attempt to regain footing only underscored how much ground she'd lost. Meanwhile, Crockett sat still, steady, her work already done. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. What began as a lopsided attack ended with Bondi's armor shattered, her shouting reduced to background noise against Crockett's clarity. The room no longer belonged to Bondi. It belonged to Crockett, and to the truth she embodied. For the audience watching at home, it was catharsis. The underdog had not only survived the attack, she had transformed it into a victory. Viewers who had bristled at Bondi's yell now felt the release of seeing it dismantled, inverted, turned back on itself with elegance. And Crockett didn't need to raise her voice once. She ended with a final pause, her eyes locked on Bondi. "If truth makes you this angry, maybe the problem isn't me." The chamber erupted again, not with noise, but with a silence so powerful it became the story. Bondi sat back, visibly shaken, her earlier bravado gone. Crockett adjusted her papers calmly, as though the mic drop she'd just delivered was nothing more than routine, because for her it was. But what happened outside the chamber was even bigger. The moment Jasmine Crockett dropped her calm, surgical counterattack, the impact didn't stay confined to the four walls of the congressional chamber. Within seconds, staffers' phones buzzed with notifications. Reporters in the gallery were already uploading clips, and as soon as the microphones cut, the real battle began, not in committee but online. Twitter was the first to ignite. The clip of Crockett's poised dismantling of Pam Bondi spread like wildfire, racking up tens of thousands of retweets before the hearing even adjourned. Hashtags erupted #Crockett clapback, #truth over noise, and the biting #Pam meltdown. The side-by-side edits flooded feeds. Bondi read, faced jabbing a finger, screaming "You're lying," contrasted with Crockett leaning calmly into the mic, her words slicing through the chaos like steel through paper. Memes arrived at lightning speed. One splits. Green showed Bondi as a sputtering volcano, while Crockett was depicted as a serene lighthouse standing firm against crashing waves. Another painted Bondi in cartoonish rage, while Crockett adjusted the mic with the caption, "Volume down, truth up." The internet had declared its victor, and the consensus was overwhelming. But it wasn't just social media warriors weighing in. Cable networks replayed the exchange on loop, pundits interrupting each other to marvel at the composure Crockett displayed. Conservative commentators tried to salvage Bondi's performance, arguing that passion is strength. But even in their defenses, the cracks showed. They couldn't escape the visual, Bondi shouting, Crockett unmoved. And in politics, optics often matter more than words. By nightfall, the moment had migrated into mainstream culture. Late-night hosts picked it up, mocking Bondi's red-faced outburst with exaggerated impressions before cutting to Crockett's mic drop line, which earned roaring applause from studio audiences. One comedian joked Bondi brought a megaphone, but Crockett brought the receipts. The punchlines practically wrote themselves, and each one deepened the contrast between chaos and composure. Crockett's supporters flooded her mentions with messages of pride and gratitude. Immigrant families posted videos of themselves watching the clip, nodding in approval, some with tears in their eyes. Young women of color stitched the video on TikTok, explaining how they had felt silenced in classrooms, boardrooms, or workplaces, until they saw Crockett's calm defiance and thought, "That's me. That's how I want to handle it next time." The ripple effect wasn't confined to supporters either. Neutral observers, the kind of Americans who rarely wade into political drama, shared the clip with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance." Even critics of Crockett's politics had to admit her composure was remarkable. Bondi, by contrast, was trending for all the wrong reasons. Behind the scenes, political allies took notice. Progressive leaders lauded Crockett's performance as a masterclass in dignity under fire. They recognized the symbolic victory, how Crockett's calm voice cut through the stereotype that shouting is the only form of strength. Bondi's allies, meanwhile, scrambled to do damage control, insisting she was passionate and unafraid to confront lies. But their spin struggled against the viral clips that had already framed the narrative. Because once the internet chooses a hero and a villain, the story rarely changes. The shockwaves spread even further. Editorials appeared the next morning, praising Crockett as the new face of composure in American politics. One columnist wrote, "In an era where rage dominates the airwaves, Crockett reminded us that dignity can still be louder than a scream." But perhaps the most telling reaction wasn't from pundits or politicians. It was from the people. Everyday Americans, tired of the constant noise, latched onto Crockett's steady delivery as a kind of relief. For them, her victory wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about proving that truth can survive chaos, that calm can withstand rage, that dignity can still triumph in a climate addicted to spectacle. Bondi may have come into the chamber with a reputation, but by the time the dust settled, she was trending as a cautionary tale. Crockett, on the other hand, had transformed into a symbol, someone who had taken the scream aimed at her and turned it into an anthem for everyone who had ever been shouted down. The exchange was no longer just politics. It was culture. It was identity. It was a moment people recognized as bigger than a hearing, bigger than two women clashing. But beyond the viral moment, the real lesson began to emerge. When the noise died down and the viral clips settled into history, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered like an echo that refused to fade. For her, it had never been about trading insults or winning the soundbite of the day. It was about something deeper, something America seemed on the verge of forgetting. Because the truth is, Crockett could have matched Bondi's volume. She could have fired back with the same fury, the same finger pointing, the same theatrical rage. But she didn't. She chose a different weapon, composure, and in doing so, she reframed the confrontation entirely. "This was never about me," she told an interviewer the next morning. "It was about showing that lies can shout, but truth can stand." That distinction became the moral center of the story. What looked like a simple clash between two women on opposite sides of the aisle revealed itself as a mirror held up to America. On one side, arrogance, the belief that sheer force and volume can bend reality. On the other, dignity, the understanding that true power doesn't need to yell. Crockett's performance wasn't just a defense of herself. It was a defense of something bigger, the value of service over self-interest, of facts over theatrics, of composure in an era addicted to chaos. She embodied the lesson that democracy doesn't need another shouting match. It needs voices willing to rise above the noise. And that's why the moment resonated so deeply. Because every viewer who watched saw more than politics. They saw their own experiences reflected back. The student dismissed by a teacher, the employee talked over in a meeting, the immigrant parent told their voice didn't count. Crockett became a vessel for all of those stories, a reminder that dignity isn't weakness, and silence in the face of arrogance isn't defeat, it can be strategy. In that sense, the hearing wasn't just about Bondi versus Crockett. It was about truth versus lies, arrogance versus service, fear versus courage. And when Crockett leaned into that microphone, she wasn't only answering Bondi. She was answering the question America has been asking itself. Who do we want to be? Because in the end, this story wasn't about Bondi, and it wasn't even just about Crockett. It was about us. It began with a shout, Pam Bondi slamming her fist on the table and screaming across the chamber, "You're lying." That single outburst was meant to dominate, to intimidate, to humiliate. But what followed flipped the script, not only in that room, but across the nation. Jasmine Crockett didn't just reply. She stunned Congress, dismantling arrogance with composure, and reminding everyone watching that truth doesn't need to yell to be heard. This is why people couldn't stop sharing the clip, why hashtags caught fire, why even critics had to pause and admit dignity carried the day. Crockett showed us that leadership isn't about volume, it's about clarity, courage, and conviction. She showed us that when lies try to shout us down, we don't have to match the noise. We can stand firm. We can let truth speak for itself. And that's the heartbeat of this channel, telling the stories that inspire, the stories that remind us who we are and what we're capable of when we refuse to bow to arrogance. So if you felt that spark watching Crockett hold her ground, if you felt proud, validated, even a little braver yourself, don't let it stop here. Subscribe now, join this community, and be part of the movement for truth, dignity, and justice. Share this story with friends who need to see it, with family members who need to feel it, with anyone who's ever been shouted down and told to stay silent, because Crockett's reply wasn't just for Congress. It was for all of us, and together we can make sure that reply keeps echoing, louder than any yell ever could.